Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Emer Cook and I'm the Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency. And it's really my pleasure to open this fourth public meeting on COVID-19. And I want to welcome everyone watching this live broadcast and also those who have joined the virtual meeting room. This meeting occurs as many countries in Europe are seeing rising infections and the hospitals are filling up again. Mainly with unvaccinated patients, but also some vaccinated. So while there's no doubt that vaccines have reduced the impact of the virus, saving people from the burden of severe disease and from death, there's still a lot more to be done. Let me stress that vaccines are continuing to prevent many millions of EU citizens from becoming very ill or dying. They're also helping to ensure that EU healthcare systems can provide routine care without the overwhelming numbers of COVID-19 patients we've seen in the past. But as we gather more evidence on how vaccines protect against the more infectious Delta variant, it becomes clearer and clearer that immune responses are waning over time, particularly in older and more vulnerable people. This means that booster doses after the second dose are needed to extend vaccine effectiveness. It's also very clear that vaccines alone are not enough as the temperatures drop in Europe. While the virus is still circulating, other public health measures such as social distancing, face masks, good ventilation and hand washing continue to be key pillars in combating the pandemic. Here in the EMA, we've paused our return to the office. We had a pilot that we were trying to bring people back to work in our office, but we're maintaining the public health measures, including mask wearing and social distancing in all our public spaces. So it's still a difficult time for all of us, and the pandemic is clearly not over, and many of you will have legitimate questions and concerns. But I have to also, on a more positive note, say it's also a time for hope, because we're in a better position today than we were this time last year, with tools such as vaccines and additional medicines now becoming available to help fight the pandemic. And they are truly making a difference, as you will hear later. The high number of people in clinical trials and the unprecedented collaboration among stakeholders were some of the reasons that these vaccines could be approved in record time. But we've also seen a huge increase in manufacturing capacity. Within less than a year, more than 800 million vaccines have been distributed across the EU, and we've also exported 1.1 billion doses to help the rest of the world. EMA experts have carefully reviewed new sites, new formulations, as well as data to support the extension of shelf lives of vaccines to help make this all happen. And the high volumes of vaccine rollout make this the largest vaccine campaign in history, which also means that we have lots of evidence on which to review and examine even very rare side effects. Vaccines remain a key instrument against COVID-19. This means it's of the utmost importance that people get vaccinated and get their full initial course of vaccine, as well as any booster doses as soon as they are recommended to do so. Nearly 77% of the EU population over 18 is now fully vaccinated, but there are still very important differences in vaccination uptake between countries. And governments in these countries are working hard to address this challenge. If we want to beat the pandemic, it's vital that we all work together and increase vaccination uptake across all countries in the EU. As I mentioned, in addition to vaccines, new therapies are starting to become available, and these will complement, although not replace, vaccines. So this meeting, we want to listen to you. We want to listen to your questions, your concerns, and to respond, to hear what challenges you see, what we can do better. We'll also share with you what EMA and EU health bodies are doing to ensure that vaccines and treatments meeting the high EU standards continue to get approved quickly and after a thorough evaluation. And how once we have approved medicines and vaccines, we continue to take every effort to ensure that they remain safe and effective. We also welcome here today another important actor in this pandemic, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC. Although the individual member states are the ones who design and implement the actual vaccination programs and are responsible for the day-to-day measures that help to control the infection, ECDC is monitoring, collaborating and analysing the outcomes, and ECDC will summarise where we are in terms of vaccinating citizens in the EU and will tell us about what impact this is having at a community level. So without any further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Fergus Sweeney, who's our Head of Clinical Studies and Manufacturing, and he's going to be moderating the event today. So over to you, Fergus.
Thank you very much, Emer, and it's also my pleasure to welcome all of you, to extend a warm welcome to this important meeting. And as Emer has said, I will be your moderator today. My name is Fergus Sweeney. I'm head of the Clinical Studies and Manufacturing Task Force here at the European Medicines Agency. Now, as our Executive Director, Emer Cook, has explained, this meeting will provide an update on key aspects of the assessment, approval, safety monitoring, and very importantly, the great impact that the 4 vaccines, Comirnaty, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Janssen, which are so far approved in the EU, have on this disease and its spread. So really important information we'll hear. We'll provide an update about some of the candidate vaccines still under review, and also on new treatments, which you'll be hearing a lot about in the media, and explain how those can work and where we are in the authorization process. Importantly, we've also heard a lot about boosters and third doses, and we'll be discussing these in the context of which they've been reviewed and recommended by the European Medicines Agency. And together with this, we'll look at other developments in the vaccination campaign, such as the use of vaccines in children and in pregnancy. Now, as many of you will be aware, there's a lot of misinformation circulating on social media, on the internet, and it's important for us to be able to guide you to show the information sources that we make available on COVID-19 treatments, vaccines, and therapeutics, and how we're working to ensure that citizens do have a reliable, transparent source of information, which is readily understandable and you can use to support your decisions. Our aim is to present the information in a public-friendly manner, so it can be understood by as wide a range of people, of citizens as possible, either online now with us or viewing this in the future. So we'll have 4 presentations to start. We'll run it similarly to our meeting in March. The first presentation is an update on approved and candidate COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics in the European Union. And this will be given by Marco Cavalieri, our head of biological health threats and vaccine strategy at EMA. He will be followed by Georgi Genov, head of pharmacovigilance at EMA, who will present on vaccine safety monitoring and with an update on emerging data since the EU authorizations. We will then have Piotr Kramarz, who's Deputy Head of Unit and Deputy Chief Scientist of the European Centre for Disease Control. As Emer said, they're joining us in this meeting, and he will present on COVID-19 surveillance and vaccination coverage in the EU. So really important information. And finally, to guide you to the sources of reliable information from the European Medicines Agency, we will hear from Melanie Carr, our Head of Stakeholders and Communication Division at EMA. The second part of the meeting is then really for you, all of our listeners. So you've joined us online or in the virtual meeting room, and then you'll have opportunities to present questions so we can hear you, respond to the questions and views that you present. We have people for general public, patients, citizens, healthcare professionals, academics, some people from the pharmaceutical industry. That's your opportunity, all of you European citizens, to pose your questions and express your concerns, and hopefully we can respond to those, and hopefully the presentations which will now start will also help to advise you. In the break, we'll provide you with a Slido link to submit questions. But without further delay, I'd like to hand over to Marco Cavalieri for our first presentation. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fergus, and good afternoon to all of you. So as said, I will give you a bit of an update of where we stand with the activities of the EMA on vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19. Next slide. This is an outline of what I will be speaking to you about. Next one. So this slide is a kind of busy one, but also shows how busy we have been throughout this pandemic so far, and we will continue to be busy. So you will see that right from the declaration of the pandemic, beginning of next year, we immediately took action, established our expert task force, and start talking to developers of new or repurposed therapeutics and also of developers of vaccines. And we started evaluation procedures already in May last year, which led to the first approval of the first therapeutic for COVID-19, which was Veklury in July last year. Then towards the end of last year and beginning of the new one, the vaccines came, and you see that 4 have been approved to start with. And then after the spring this year, we started doing a lot of activities with respect to approving variation of the vaccines initially approved in order to enlarge their use and the recommendation for use in pediatric population to start with. And then importantly, in October around the booster use. And also we have been approving additional therapeutics now, Rekiron and Ronapreve, and I will tell you more in a few minutes. But this is just to show the intense work that has gone through in these months and that we will continue carrying on towards the end of this pandemic. Next slide. Let's start with the vaccines. And the first important statement is what is written here on these slides. So vaccines have reduced the impact of the virus, and they do remain a key tool to combat the pandemic. As you know, the Delta variant is spreading around. However, the vaccines are remaining effective, saving thousands, or I would say hundreds of thousands, from hospitalization and death. However, there is still more to do. As you know, cases of infections are rising throughout Europe, and also hospitalizations are growing as a consequence of that. However, it's important for me to underline that most hospitalization and deaths are seen in people that are not vaccinated. Even if still we are seeing that also some vaccinated people, they can get hospitalized with COVID. And this is because there are no vaccines that are 100% effective. And when you vaccinate millions of people and the virus is spreading around quite substantially, you may end up with few cases in which severe disease might occur. But still, they are a tiny proportion of the entirety of people that have been vaccinated. We are also been seeing that protection tends to wane over time, and this is not unexpected. For many vaccines, we've seen the protection decreases after the primary vaccination. And so we may need to restore that protection by using booster doses. Next slide. Indeed, we have already seen emerging data that show how booster doses are able to restore protection against infection of disease, and they confer really high level of antibodies, much higher than what we see after completion of the primary vaccination. As you know, most EU member states are already giving boosters, and the boosters for Comirnaty and Spikevax, which are the messenger RNA vaccine for Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, respectively, have been approved by the EMA with a 6 months interval after the completion of the second dose, so the primary series in adults. And this opinion came up in a timely way at the beginning of October, leaving flexibility on the use of the booster doses depending on the epidemiological situation in the countries, acknowledging that things would be moving very dynamically throughout this cold season and with respect to decision taken by public health authorities. Also, we are evaluating a booster dose for the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine that should be given from 2 months after the first dose in adults. As you know, the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine requires a single dose for completing the primary vaccination series. We have also been approving extra doses of Comirnaty and Spikevax for people with severely weakened immune systems aged 12 years and older, because we saw that indeed in this group of people that are not responding well to vaccination, a third dose is very important in order to increase the immune response. And I'm also glad to anticipate to you that today the CHMP gave a positive opinion for the use of Comirnaty in children from 5 years of age, including children that have severely weakened immune system, similarly to what we already decided here for those 12 years and older. Next slide. What about the safety of the booster doses, which is a question that has been emerging quite substantially? First of all, let me say that this is the largest vaccination campaign ever, and the safety profile that we've seen so far is very reassuring. The current data will show that the common side effects after the booster are very similar to what we've seen after the second dose of either Comirnaty or Spikevax. And now there is a growing number of people that are receiving the booster dose, and so far we are not seeing any specific safety concern emerging, which is extremely reassuring. Of course, the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis or other very rare side effects after boosting are carefully monitored, and you will hear more about what we're doing in terms of safety monitoring for vaccines for COVID-19. Next slide. Another important area of discussion has been the possibility of mix and matching different vaccines, what is called heterologous vaccination. And you see here in this slide that this heterologous vaccination could occur in the context of the primary series for vaccination, in which you give a certain type of vaccine as first dose and another type as a second one. But it can also happen in the context of heterologous boosting. In this case, maybe a single type of vaccine has been given for the primary vaccination series with 2 doses, and then a booster with a different type of vaccine is administered. And so far, what we've seen that there is a very good immune response with certain type of heterologous primary vaccination or heterologous booster vaccination schemes, which is extremely reassuring and extremely important because it will increase the flexibility in the member states on which vaccine to use in the context of primary vaccination or boosting. And EMA will be providing some recommendation based on the current evidence of what could be the best strategies to be used in the context of heterologous primary vaccination or heterologous boosting. And we are still aiming to come up with this recommendation by the end of next week or soon thereafter. Next slide. As said, a very important topic is what about the use of COVID-19 vaccines in children? And we know that severe COVID-19 and death remain quite rare among children. However, disease of all severity still occur in all the pediatric ages. Moreover, high transmission results in increased hospitalization in children of all ages, and we are seeing this according to the most recent epidemiological data from Europe and other parts of the world. Although children with underlying conditions would be more vulnerable to the consequences of the infection with this virus, healthy children do also represent the majority of pediatric hospitalization in the European Union based on the data collected from the ECDC. After COVID-19, moreover, children can suffer from what is called the multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which is quite a nasty disease and can be very severe with admission to intensive care in up to 70% of the cases. So another quite detrimental effect of infection with COVID-19 in pediatric ages. The children also can be exposed to the long-term consequences of COVID-19, which is currently poorly understood and would go into the generic name of long COVID or post-acute COVID. But we have the impression that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg and we need to learn more about what this means and what really is the burden of disease associated with the long-term consequences of infection with this virus in the pediatric population. Next slide. So, from an EMA perspective, as said before, the two messenger RNA vaccine, Comirnaty and Spikevax, have been approved for the use in children from 12 years of age. And also, as said, I'm glad to tell you that Comirnaty from today has received approval for children 5 to 11 years of age. And this is based on a different dose than the one used in adults, essentially is a much lower dose. Spikevax is under review for a very similar age group, so from 6 to 11 years old. Member states are then able to decide on how to use this vaccine in children as part of their vaccination campaign. But EMA is always working together with the ECDC, trying to give all the support that we can to national authorities in helping them with making their decisions. Next slide. Another important area is what the impact of COVID-19 in pregnancy and how much vaccines could help here as well. COVID-19 indeed can be particularly dangerous for pregnant women, and vaccination offers them protection. We have seen already data that clearly show that the messenger RNA vaccine are able to prevent COVID-19 in this vulnerable group. And also studies on safety of the messenger RNA vaccine in pregnancy are at the moment not suggesting any safety concern. Considering that now we are seeing pregnant women going to hospital because of COVID and also to the intensive care, it's very important that we consider vaccination in this vulnerable group in order to save the life of the mothers and the children. Next slide. So, as you know, our process requires that we continue maintaining our standard with respect to quality, safety, and efficacy of the medicinal products and the vaccine, but at the same time trying to speed up as much as we can in order that effective vaccines and therapeutics can reach patients in need and the general population as soon as possible. And in the context of the conditional marketing authorization that was granted for all the COVID-19 vaccine up to date, we have been recently renewing for another year this authorization for 3 of them, Spikevax, Comirnaty, and Vaxzevria. And at the same time, we are trying to look into a way of accelerating the process to come up with a full marketing authorization as soon as we can. And so there will be more to follow in this area as well. Next slide. You can see here on our website all the information with respect to what the EMA is doing with respect to COVID-19 vaccine, which one have been authorized, which one are under evaluation or rolling review, and where we stand overall with the appraisal of vaccines for COVID. Next slide. With respect to vaccines that are in more advanced evaluation stage, Nuvaxovid, which is the vaccines from Novavax, which is the first protein-based vaccine, is undergoing an evaluation for marketing authorization. This is based essentially on the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is a key protein on the surface of the virus that acts a bit as the key in order for the virus to enter into the cells in our body. It also contains an adjuvant that helps strengthen the immune response to the vaccine. The start of the final assessment after rolling review has been completed, and now we are entering to the final phase of the evaluation. And we do really hope to conclude on this vaccine as soon as we can. Next slide. There are other vaccines that are still undergoing rolling review by the EMA, and the 3 of them, you see them on this slide. The first one is the one called Sputnik 5. We started rolling review in March. It's based on 2 different adenoviruses as viral vector, so in a kind of heterologous vaccination, and is developed by the Gamaleya National Center of Epidemiology and Microbiology. Then we got another vaccine, which is called the CoronaVac. This vaccine is based on another platform technology. Essentially is a whole virus that has been inactivated, so killed and used in order to generate an immune response that will be protective. and this is developed by Sinovac Life Science. And the third one that is under rolling review is called Vitpreftin. This is based on a more traditional technology similarly to the Novavax one, so it's the spike protein with an adjuvanting system, and this is developed by Sanofi Pasteur. Next slide. Now, moving away from vaccines and entering into the area of therapeutics, it's important for me to start by saying that therapeutics could be extremely important in order to complement but not replace the role the vaccines have in the fight against COVID-19. New or repurposed therapeutic could treat or prevent COVID-19, and we've seen quite a large evidence on a number of investigational agents in this regard. They are therefore expected to provide an additional tool to reduce the burden of disease associated with COVID-19. And we could argue that therapeutics would be particularly relevant for vulnerable groups and people who do not respond adequately for vaccination. Next slide. So what kind of products are we talking about? Essentially, we have two big areas of type of medicine. The first one are so-called biological medicine and include neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, which are made of proteins that are able to attach to the virus and stopping it from entering into the cells in our body and therefore preventing the spread of the virus and the severe symptoms that will occur once the virus is spreading. Others, on the contrary, will work as immunomodulatory agents, so with a very different mechanism of action, and they are aimed to reduce the activity of the body's immune system with the aim of reducing inflammation and ultimately respiratory failure and death. Some other agents are chemical medicine. They can be small antiviral molecules that can be given orally, which is a big advantage. And they can act on different targets within the virus, either the polymerase, which is the machinery for creating new viral particles, or certain specific proteins like the protease, which are necessary for assembling viruses that can then proliferate into the body. Other chemical agents work as immunomodulatory agents, so similarly to some of the biologics, and they would help to stabilize the abnormal immune responses that we see once the disease is progressing and patient gets severe COVID. Next slide. And you can find here on our website all information as well on therapeutic, as I just mentioned, but also even more. Next slide. So far we got 3 therapeutics agents authorized in the European Union. As mentioned before, Veklury, that is based on remdesivir, has been the first one to be approved for the treatment of COVID in people from 12 years of age with pneumonia requiring extra oxygen. And as said, recently we approved these 2 monoclonal antibodies product. The first one is based on the monoclonal called remdesivir, which is approved for the treatment of COVID-19 in adults at increased risk of severe disease. So before really they get a COVID that requires hospitalization. And a similar indication has been granted for Ronapreve, which is based on a cocktail of 2 monoclonal antibodies, casirivimab and imdevimab. And also this cocktail has been approved for the prevention of COVID-19 in people from 12 years of age on top of the treatment of disease indication similarly to remdesivir. Next slide. But there are many more that we are evaluating. And you see here on this slide the 3 specific immunomodulatory agents that we are evaluating for marketing authorization. The first one is based on baricitinib, which is a repurposed agent. All of them actually, they are repurposed agents. And this one is for the treatment of COVID-19 in hospitalized patients from 10 years of age who require extra oxygen. Similar indications are also going to be looked at for anakinra, which is another immunomodulatory agent, and tocilizumab as well, which has been quite widely discussed since the start of the pandemic as a potential option for treatment of severe COVID. And we do really hope that at least for some of these agents, we will be able to come up with an approval before the end of this year. Next slide. Then there are 2 products that have already started the actual marketing authorization as new therapeutics, so not repurposed agents. One is sotrovimab, which is another monoclonal antibodies for a similar indication as the other one that I mentioned just earlier. And then the second one is molnupiravir, Lagevrio, which is one of these small molecule antivirals that can be given by oral route and therefore are quite attractive considering that they are supposed to be used essentially in the community. Next slide. And also under rolling review, there is another agent, which is another cocktail of monoclonal antibody composed of dixagevimab and silgavimab under the name of Evusheld. And this one, really, the development has been initially focused on the prevention of COVID-19 in adults, although there are also studies emerging with respect to the treatment, similarly to what we're seeing with the other monoclonals. So the pipeline of antiviral agents is quite lively and quite robust, and we do really hope that in the near future we will be able to conclude at least with some of them. Next slide. Specifically, with respect to the oral antivirals, Lagevrio, so based on molnupiravir, but also an additional one that is called the Paxlovid, which is developed by Pfizer for a similar indication as molnupiravir. We have been looking into the preliminary evidence that has become available, at least with respect to molnupiravir. We were able to give an advice to member states with respect to the potential use in the context of emergency use for this antiviral agent. And we will do the same also for Paxlovid, should the evidence that we have be sufficient to do so. We think that this is very important since we don't have an emergency use authorization at European level, and this can be used as a kind of surrogate in order to support member states' decision with respect to the emergency use of these antiviral drugs. Next slide. So this is my conclusive slide. And first of all, let me reiterate that vaccines protect against the heavy burden of disease and death related to COVID-19 and remain the crucial tool in the fight against this pandemic. Infections, as you know, are growing in Europe as a result of the spread of the Delta variant, the cold season, the waning immunity after the primary vaccination, and relaxation of social measures in many places. Vaccination coverage in some places is unfortunately still very low, leaving many unvaccinated people vulnerable to severe disease. Now it's time to fill this vaccination gap, and we should do this as soon as we can as a top priority. Booster doses in parallel are also very important since they are able to restore the protection of people who already had their primary cycle and bring back the same level of protection from infection and disease. Besides vaccines, safe and effective therapeutics will be extremely helpful in the fight against COVID-19, but they do not replace vaccination. So they should be seen as a complementary tool, very important because unfortunately many more people will get sick with this virus. European citizens are encouraged to get vaccinated and follow public health measures recommended by the authorities in order to keep themselves safe and the infection levels low. We are pretty confident that with all these tools and all with these measures, we will be able to cut down the burden of disease associated with this virus and end this pandemic in the near future. I will stop here and I will hand over to my colleague, Georg Genov, who will talk about what we're doing around safety monitoring. Over to you, Georg.
Thank you very much, Marco. Good afternoon, all. I'm Georgi Genov, and I'm the head of pharmacovigilance at the European Medicines Agency. If we move on to the outline of my presentation, I firstly would like to highlight that COVID-19 vaccination campaign is the largest ever, and based on the wealth of information that we have received and evaluated, the safety profile of COVID-19 vaccines remains very reassuring. In the next 15 minutes, I will provide a high-level overview of safety monitoring of COVID-19 vaccines. Moving on to the next slide, let me start with a brief reminder as to why do we need to monitor safety after approval. All medicines, including vaccines, have benefits and risks. As with any mass vaccination campaign, issues might arise that have not been identified in clinical trials. As regulators, we need to detect those act swiftly, and communicate in full transparency. To manage these exceptional circumstances, additional resources are being mobilized to closely monitor safety. Moving on to the next slide. Here, one of the main pillars of safety monitoring is review of suspected side effects reported by patients and healthcare professionals. Anybody can report, and all reports are sent to EudraVigilance, our European database of suspected side effects. I would like to use this opportunity to express our gratitude to all that took the time to submit to EudraVigilance this important information to allow us to closely monitor the safety of COVID-19 vaccines. On the next slide, you could see the impressive size of the vaccination campaign, both in terms of doses administered, that you can see in the green bubbles, but also the wealth of information we have received. It is essential to understand that reports from patients and healthcare professionals describe medical events that have occurred following vaccination, which doesn't necessarily mean that they've been caused by the vaccine. Those could very well be caused by other health conditions that have occurred in temporal association to the use of the vaccine. It is also important to put the numbers of suspected side effects in the context of how many people have been vaccinated and for how long. Moving on to the next slide. Let's take the key question: do COVID-19 vaccine remain safe? The safety of vaccine is continuously monitored. COVID-19 vaccines with over 589 million doses administered continue to show a very reassuring safety profile. As with all medicines, side effects do occur, but these are usually mild, are outweighed by far by the benefits that vaccines bring against severe disease and death. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's focus our attention on a few examples of risks detected and managed post-approval. Our pharmacovigilance system has been particularly efficient in detecting and managing new safety issues. EU was at the forefront of dealing with the very rare side effects of unusual blood clots with low blood platelets, the so-called thrombosis and thrombocytopenia syndrome, or TTS. We have detected earlier the risk and managed the risk for Vaxzevria, and we have been proactive in dealing with the risk for Janssen and acted even before the vaccine was rolled out in the EU. It is important to note that TTS cases remain very rare, and at the bottom of this slide, I draw your attention to symptoms to be aware of post-vaccination to detect early this very rare condition. Let's move on to another example of safety issue on the next slide, detected and managed. This relates to myocarditis post-vaccination with mRNA vaccines, which occurs in very rare cases, and it is observed primarily in the 14 days after vaccination, more often after the second dose, and more often in younger male. It's important to know that the course of this condition is generally mild and responds very well to treatment. When discussing risks, it is important to put those in the context of benefits that vaccination provides in terms of preventing hospitalization and death. For this particular condition, we should also note that COVID-19 itself can cause myocarditis. And if we consider for children and adolescents the risk that COVID causes that Marco described earlier, the so-called MIS, multi-system inflammatory syndrome, we should know that this condition can also cause myocarditis as a result of COVID, among other serious complications. Let's move on to the next slide. We as regulators are committed to continuously monitor the benefits and risk of vaccines. And so how do we look at reports? A scientific assessment looks at the suspected side effects in the context of the person's individual case to determine if it may be caused by the vaccine or it might have occurred for other reasons. Side effects assessed in the context of all available data on the vaccines, and this could include clinical trials, other studies, and the scientific literature. We draw science-based conclusions on the benefits and the risk and could take a number of different actions if these are warranted. Let's move on to the next slide. Unfortunately, we have seen a lot of misinformation circulating online, including posts in social media misappropriating our logo and providing inaccurate information. So it is very important to get the facts right and refer to reliable sources of information, such as the websites of medicine regulators. So on our website, we have medicine overview addressing questions and answers in lay language. We publish the risk management plans, which describe how safety data is collected and how risk can be mitigated. And we have recommendations and precautions for the safe and effective use of each approved vaccine. For healthcare professionals, this can be found in the summary of product characteristics, and for patients in the package leaflet. Furthermore, if we move to the next slide, we publish on a monthly basis safety updates, which contain the main outcomes from the PRAC latest safety assessment and inform of what new information will be added to the product information, as well as updates on assessments of new safety data, overall information on how safety is monitored, and some background information on the vaccines. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, in addition to reports we review on a very intensive basis in reports submitted in vigilance, as well as studies requested to the vaccine manufacturers and careful review of all published scientific literature, we have commissioned independent EMA studies, which allow us to quickly generate background rates and support prompt evaluation of any arising new safety concerns. So moving to the next slide. In the context of COVID-19, we have seen and we have benefited from a very intense collaboration with other regulators. We have used established frameworks and have set up new ones in order to exchange promptly information, to get access to worldwide data, and also to use assessments from other regulators and expertise. Let's move on to the next slide. In conclusion, let me highlight the main points. COVID-19 is the largest vaccine campaign ever, and the safety profile of the vaccines remains very reassuring. A strong EU pharmacovigilance system is in place. Safety is our priority and will not be compromised. Unprecedented efforts have been made to manage high volume of safety information. Very rare side effects, some serious, have been detected quickly, assessed promptly, and acted upon. And this has been supported by continuous transparency and communication to the public. We have enhanced tools for safety monitoring and frameworks for risk communication and quite intensive international collaboration. COVID-19 vaccine safety is stronger with your participation. Please continue to report suspected side effects. That ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. With that, I will pass to the next speaker.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Piotr. Thank you.
My name is Piotr Kramars. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientist at the ECDC in Stockholm. We work very closely with our colleagues at the European Medicines Agency, and it's my pleasure to present at this very important meeting. Next slide, please. I will tell you a little about ECDC role, and then I will show you some update on the global and EU epidemiological situation. And then finally, I will show you some information about the current status of the vaccine uptake, about the genomic variants, and about the importance of so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions. A lot of what I'll be presenting comes from ECDC work as part of the public health emergency. We raised the level of alert to the highest second level at the beginning of last year already, and we've remained at that level since then. Next slide, please. ECDC is an EU agency like the European Medicines Agency, and we are responsible for coordinating prevention and control of communicable diseases in the EU. And as part of this, we conduct epidemiological surveillance at the EU level. And for COVID, it means monitoring of case, death, testing rates, test positivity, which is like a proportion of all the tests that come out positive for COVID, and more. We also provide support to public health microbiology work of the member states. And as part of this, we issue guidance on rapid antigen test use or genetic sequencing based on all the information that we collect and expert considerations. We issue scientific advice about the optimal ways to combat COVID. And in that, we provide options for the member states to prevent and to fight COVID. And the member states choose the right options depending on their situation. We also provide direct support to member states when needed and when requested. And for example, now we are working especially closely with countries with a low vaccination coverage to help them change this situation. And finally, we provide preparedness support, capacity building, and health communication support. On the picture, you see our emergency operations center. I myself am part of a roster of so-called emergency managers, and I work there from time to time on shifts as an emergency manager. Next slide, please. Let's start with a look at the global situation. This graph shows you the evolution of the numbers of cases over time globally, and you can see that the story is not over. We are going through another wave of COVID, and it's very much driven by what is happening in Europe, the dark blue bars on the graph. But compared to the previous waves, we have more effective tools, and especially we have vaccination, and we have to use it to the maximum potential. Next slide, please. Let's focus now on the situation in Europe. On this picture, you can see two graphs. The blue curve shows the behavior of the case rate, and you see the rapid increase in the recent weeks. And the green curve shows you the slow increase in the death rates. And this discrepancy between the rapid increase of the cases and slow increase in deaths is largely contributable to the use of vaccines. Vaccines do prevent transmission, as you heard, an infection, but not at 100%. But they are very good at preventing death and severe COVID. And you can see it on this graph. And next slide, please. But the use of the vaccines is just one of the important factors that are driving the situation at the moment. And looking at the vaccination uptake, as of today, around 66% of the total population is vaccinated fully, and around 77% of the adult population, which means that more than 20% of the adult population for whom vaccines are available and recommended are not vaccinated. Secondly, what is driving the recent developments to a large extent is the spread of the Delta variant. The Delta variant, you will see on my next slides, is dominating in Europe now, and it's up to 60% more transmissible than Alpha, the previously predominant variant, and Alpha was already more transmissible than the original Wuhan variant. Finally, what we observed during the summer and shortly after was a widespread relaxation of so-called non-pharmaceutical measures. And these include things like physical distancing, face mask wearing, various hygienic measures. And this is also contributing to what we see now, all the increases and worsening of the situation. Next slide, please. So let's first look at the impact of vaccination. On this curve, you can see the evolution of death rates over time since the beginning of this year until now. And this is displayed by the different levels of vaccine uptake in different countries. And you can compare the steeply increasing curve on the top, the orange one. These are death rates in countries with the lowest vaccination uptake. And then you can compare it to the bottom of the graph, where you see what is happening in countries with the highest vaccine uptake. And you can see the difference. This is because vaccines prevent deaths. And you will see that they also prevent severe COVID on the next slide. So here you can see a similar situation when we look at the hospital occupancy over time. Again, the hospital occupancy increases or doesn't increase. The curves are quite flat when the vaccine uptake is the highest. Next slide, please. Here you can see similar picture when you look at the intensive care unit occupancy over time. And this is very important. As I said several times, the vaccines are very good at preventing severe COVID, hospitalizations, intensive care admissions, deaths. It's important because this saves lives and protects health, but it's also very important to protect the healthcare systems and the healthcare workers who are under a lot of pressure, and this pressure has been increasing in the recent weeks. Next slide, please. No single parameter can reflect the situation, the pandemic situation at this stage of the pandemic. And at ECDC, we use now a composite indicator, which combines case notification rates, test positivity, situation among the elderly, situation in the hospitals, and death rates into one indicator. And the darkness of the color corresponds to the level of concern in the situation. When you move from the west to the east of Europe, roughly, you can see that the situation worsens and the level of concern increases. You can see the evolution of this indicator at weekly intervals. We update these graphs on Thursdays. Next slide, please. And you can compare it now to the vaccine uptake. You can see now the level of vaccine uptake in Europe. Again, moving from west to east, roughly, you can see that the vaccine uptake gets lower. And it doesn't take much time to see the correlation. The higher the vaccine uptake, the lower the level of concern with the current pandemic situation. Next slide, please. You probably noticed on my previous slide that I showed you the status as of November 14, but it doesn't change very much. You can see here on this graph the behavior of the vaccine uptake over time in different age groups. And you can see that after a slow start at the beginning of the year, when there were a few doses available, then there was a period of quite rapid increase. But in the recent weeks, there has been a plateauing of all the curves, almost all of them. And it's very difficult to move even by 1%. And this is very worrying. Next slide, please. Another important factor that is driving the recent developments is the spread of the Delta variant. Monitoring of genomic variants of the virus is extremely important. This virus mutates as all coronaviruses do. It changes and new variants emerge. And it's very important to detect early any new variants with changed transmissibility or severity of disease or effectiveness of vaccines or medicines. The capacity for such monitoring varies quite a lot across the EU, but it's increasing. And we at ECDC work very closely, on the one hand, with the European Commission, and on the other hand, with the member states to improve the infrastructure and to train personnel so that this capacity for genomic monitoring increases. And it will be used not only for COVID, but hopefully in the future for other pathogens. Based on all this monitoring, we can see that the Delta variant is now dominating Europe. It evolves further, and there are some sublineages which we closely monitor. One of them you probably heard about is the AY 4.2. It has slightly increased transmissibility. It doesn't seem to cause more severe disease or escape immunity. But it's extremely important to reduce the viral transmission at the moment and the viral spread, because the more of this spread, the higher the chance that a new variant with some dangerous properties will emerge. Next slide. And you can do this on the one hand through vaccination, but on the other hand through so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as physical distancing, mask wearing where indicated, hand hygiene, etc. we have increasing evidence that they work. They work not only for COVID, for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but for other respiratory viruses like the influenza virus. But their effectiveness depends on how early and how swiftly they are implemented. And when they are implemented, they have to be accompanied by clear risk communication to explain to the population why they are introduced, based on what parameters, and when they will be lifted. Community engagement is key here. ECDC, together with the Joint Research Center, maintains a database of measures of these non-pharmaceutical interventions implemented by the member states. And when we looked at this database, we noticed that at the beginning of November, overall fewer measures were in place when compared to the situation a year ago at the same time or 6 months ago. And also this is driving the current developments. Next slide. So I would like to leave you with 3 key messages. The first one is that the highest priority is the continued effort to increase vaccination coverage, to vaccinate those for whom vaccination is recommended and who are not vaccinated. We have to close the gaps in vaccination everywhere. Secondly, EU and EEA countries should consider a booster dose for adult population, especially those 40 years of age and over, targeting first, of course, the most vulnerable and the elderly. And finally, even in countries with high vaccine uptake, maintaining or reintroducing the non-pharmaceutical measures remains vital to reduce transmission. We are approaching now the end of year festive season when people will be traveling, they will be shopping, they will be meeting with their families, their friends. And applying these measures will help control the spread of the virus, and we will protect the health and the lives and the healthcare systems functioning. Next slide, please. We've observed during this pandemic an unprecedented spread of misinformation and disinformation. In fact, the next presentation will be about this. And the best way to address it is to spread facts, factual information, and evidence-based information. And I would like to encourage you to visit these links and help us review the information there and help us spread this through your networks, starting with the rapid risk assessment that we just published yesterday on our website. And I presented you some elements that come from this rapid risk assessment, but you have much more there. So please start with this first link. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to acknowledge all the member state experts with whom we work, who submit the data that we analyze and that I presented to you. And they also help us with our scientific advice development, and all the ECDC colleagues with whom I have a pleasure to work. Thank you very much. And now to introduce Melanie Carr, who will talk about addressing the misinformation about COVID. Melanie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Piotr, and good afternoon to everyone. So in my presentation, I would like to highlight the importance of reaching out to reputable sources for information, echoing the comments of many of the previous speakers. On to the next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on aspects of misinformation, talk about how we at the EMA are working to address it through communication and transparency and engagement with stakeholders. On to the next one, please. Now, just by way of background, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given the magnitude and the gravity of the pandemic, we are seeing a high level of misinformation and disinformation circulating, which has a large public health impact. It undermines trust in medicines, fuels vaccine hesitancy, and limits uptake of life-saving vaccines. In particular, social media is being used to propagate an infodemic where disinformation and misinformation are being spread. It's also supporting, in some sense, the polarization of public debate on topics related to COVID-19. It's therefore critical that we work hard to stem the tide of misinformation and address confusing or misleading information head-on. On to the next one, please. So a few words about what we're doing at EMA. We're working to identify particular concerns and misinformation as early as possible, looking at the sorts of issues being raised in queries we receive from members of the public. We're not doing this alone. We're working closely with our regulatory partners, notably our colleagues at the European Commission and WHO. We're also engaging in active dialogue with the public and our stakeholders to listen to your concerns. Our aim is to address proactively and, if you like, pre-bunk the myths, trying to address the concerns before they take hold. We're also working hard to set the record straight as far as we can and have our voices heard on social media and through other communication channels. And our aim is to communicate the fact-based science that supports our regulatory decisions, and of course to ensure full transparency on EMA's actions and decisions, and also on any data supporting our regulatory decisions. On to the next one, please. I'd like to give a couple of examples of misinformation that have come up recently. This first one relates to reports of suspected side effects reported in our safety database, which is called Vigilance. And these were picked up on social media. There were false reports showing inflated numbers of side effects reported with the vaccines that were wrongly claiming to be sourced from EMA. So to address this now, the agency provides a summary of the overall number of side effect reports and also publishes monthly safety updates that we produce for each of the vaccines. These reports put the number of suspected side effects into the context of the doses given, and also provide the latest information on the safety profile in those monthly reports. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an image from our website where you can go and find access to the real numbers and also for further explanation. On to the next one, please. And another example, this one relates to claims that there is insufficient data on the quality, safety, and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines, primarily due to the speed at which they've been developed and brought to the market. Now, to address this, EMA has published information explaining how vaccines are developed and authorized and how this can be condensed without compromising standards. And again, we've produced some infographics which are shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. And this really is supported by some material which explains how vaccines are developed, comparing to more standard cycles, and how that is brought much shorter to the market. Once again, we want to emphasize that there are extensive study results to support the vaccines, and we have full transparency on the basis of the authorizations. This is detailed in the assessments. So we publish European public assessment reports, and also we publish the clinical data that underpins those assessments. On then to a few words about how we're communicating. On to the next one. So yes, indeed, we are communicating. We've developed a number of new information materials, or several tiers of information on development and approval of vaccines. We're also responding to queries from members of the public, as well as patients, healthcare professionals, academia, and media. We're updating on key developments with regular bi-weekly press briefings, organising public meetings such as this one, and also engaging on social media. We're also undertaking more and more interviews with the media. Working with ECDC to provide content for the European Vaccination Information Portal. And importantly, on the portal, you'll find information on vaccines in all EU languages. And as and when needed, we will be providing safety communications to complement regular monthly safety updates. Now, I'd also like to share some examples on the next slide of the information we're publishing. So this slide shows an image that we've produced for Twitter, which is updated every week. And that really provides a snapshot overview of the vaccines which are under rolling review, evaluation, or authorized. And we produce a similar one for therapeutics. On to the next one then. And this again, referring back to how vaccines are developed and authorized, provides the different tiers of information where you can go in and read an explanation about that. It also covers the post-marketing monitoring phase. And again, it clarifies that vaccines are being developed following the same legal requirements for pharmaceutical quality, safety, and efficacy as for other medicines. On to the next one, please. Now, in terms of information on vaccines, we provide several levels of information. So you can start by looking at the high-level product information. You can look at medicines overviews, which are written in very simple, plain language. Then you can delve into more detail into the assessment itself in the European Public Assessment Reports. And then if you'd like to go into more detail on the clinical data, you can access the clinical data on this area of our website, which is shown on this slide. And that shows the data that has underpinned those regulatory decisions. It includes the clinical summaries, but also the clinical study reports. On to the next one, please. And this is just another example of the information we're putting out on social media. It shows how we're communicating on the evaluation and the approval of COVID-19 vaccines, primarily on Twitter and LinkedIn, and we have a simple timeline on the right-hand side to visualize the process. On to the next one. And this just summarizes who we're working with. So we're actively engaging with patients, healthcare professionals, through their representatives in the pandemic task force, also very importantly through our regular working party interactions. And they're also assisting us in user testing our information materials, and we're doing more and more of this. Working closely with the European Commission, with ECDC and the national competent authorities, we're also making efforts to communicate information in the most meaningful way, so using plain language and again, user testing the messages to promote understanding. On to the next one, please. Now, we are very keen to listen to the public and our stakeholders and address any concerns on vaccines as they arise. We launched the first in our series of public stakeholder meetings in December, and today's meeting brings us to a total of 4. Links of the previous meetings are provided here for ease of access. On to the next one, please. And really, this is just to close. So in terms of the take-home messages from me, it really is to be wary of misinformation. It can have serious consequences. So to ensure you get the facts, go to the public health authorities and other reputable sources of information. Ensuring access to reliable information, good and timely communication and transparency are really key to reinforcing trust in decisions of regulators, but also in understanding the rationale that underpins those all-important decisions on medicines and vaccines. And it's not just about transparency, it's about providing access to clinical data. We don't just want to publish information, we also want to add context, explain the science in plain language. Engagement is really crucial for us, so actively listening to your questions, to any concerns you have so we can hopefully address them, and involving stakeholders and members of the public in our activities. And on that note, we're very much looking forward to discussing with you today. So on my final slide, I'll leave you to a link to our corporate website for further information, where you'll find all information on COVID accessible through our COVID homepage. So thank you very much, and I'll now pass the floor back to Fergus. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you very much to all our presenters. They've been really insightful, good information, and excellent timekeeping as well. So thank you. We've got a good overview now of the assessment, the safety, and the epidemiological situation, and how the vaccines are working really importantly to combat COVID-19. We're now going to break for 5 minutes, and then we'll begin our open session when the floor is yours. All of you have the opportunity to answer questions, and we really encourage you to use the Slido. I know some are sending in questions through other channels in social media, but please, I encourage everybody, whatever way you're listening, to use the Slido. Will display a slide now giving the Slido address link so that you can submit questions. And we'll come back in about 5 minutes, so 2:15, 2:15 where we are, but we have people in many time zones, so 2:15. See you then. I'm looking forward to a really active discussion. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We now have our panel session. We're going to give the floor to various members of the public who've been invited to join us here in the virtual WebEx room. We have citizens, patients, carers, consumers, healthcare professionals, pharmaceutical industry, and academia, and people from a wide range of countries. At the latest, I know we have people from 21 EU member states and 21 non-EU countries, so wide range, and I think well over 800 people, possibly many more, following us online. We received a large number of requests to speak, and unfortunately could not accommodate everyone. During the process, we've endeavored to include a well-balanced group of stakeholders, different affiliations and geographical locations, and we've used a random selection process for this to provide fairness. We invite those who've joined us in the WebEx room to raise their hand to take the microphone and speak. When speaking, please switch on your cameras. We encourage you to switch on your cameras because that improves the interactivity of the session and brings everybody into the room, so to speak. And also encourage my panelists, they're all switching on their cameras as well. In addition to the oral interventions from people in the WebEx room, everybody who is online can submit questions using the Slido, which we provided. So please send in your questions. I know there are hundreds of questions coming in. We won't be able to address them all, but we will endeavor to cover the range of topics that are being raised. Now on the panel, we're joined by our speakers and panelists. I have Emer Cook, our Executive Director of EMA, Marco Cavalieri, Head of Biological Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy, Georgi Genov, Head of Pharmacovigilance, Melanie Carr, Head of our Stakeholders and Communications, Piotr Kramarz, who's Deputy Chief Scientist for the European Centre for Disease Control. We're also joined by Peter Arlett, Head of Data Analytics and Methodology at the European Medicines Agency. And I'd like now to pass the floor to Juan Garcia Burgos, who's Head of Public and Stakeholder Engagement at the agency, and he will assist in reading out the questions or handing the floor to people who are in the room to speak. So I'll hand over to Juan. I'd ask everybody, panelists and participants, if we can be succinct in asking and responding to questions, so we can cover as many as possible, but hopefully also be as clear as possible in responding. So we have now about 45, 50 minutes for a good discussion. So please, we're really keen to hear from you. We know these are challenging times. Thank you. Juan.
Thank you very much, Fergus, and good afternoon, everyone. So I will try, as Fergus says, to coordinate all the questions which are coming, preferably through a Slido, but also to try to alternate and give the floor to the people who are in the room. And we have already one hand raised from Ansela Santos. So Ansela, please, can you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you see the video. Okay. Thank you. I have a question regarding boosters. So I would like to know which type of studies are companies doing on boosters, and how is efficacy being measured? Like, so what are the endpoints? Thank you.
I'll pass that question to Marco Cavalieri. Marco, please.
Yes, so the approval of the boosters for the 2 messenger RNA vaccine has been based essentially on studies that look into the immune response after the booster, and to compare that immune response with the immune response that was seen at the end of the primary vaccination series. And also we look at the same time at the safety. So these studies were agreed as the basis for an approval. At the same time, I have to say that we have seen also some randomized trial that look into the booster effect, which also support the fact that an increased immune response translates into an increased protection. And so these types of studies are the ones that are required for approval. At the same time, we are looking into real-world evidence to really understand how much protection is waning over time, and when could be the best timing for giving a booster, and what you achieve after you receive a booster. And I have to say that we've seen a number of studies published in the literature and also reported by public health authorities that are showing that we have some decrease in protection over time. And we are also seeing, starting from the data from Israel, that the boosters are able to restore the initial protection, both from infection and from disease.
Thank you very much, Juan, and thank you, Ansel, for the question. That's really important that we're all clear on this. Juan.
We have a question in the chat. This question is from Dr. René Jacob Bestlin, and he's commenting that the multiplication of national bodies, which are not always in agreement, sometimes make it very difficult to give messages, single messages, and it's also difficult for caregivers to act. And it's mentioning that a single European voice could be desirable.
So thank you, René. This is really important. There's a lot of work going on. I'd like to invite Emer Cook, our director, to address. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much. And I think this is something that is at the forefront of many people's minds at the moment. And we are all understanding our collective responsibility to give clear and consistent messages, not just across Europe, but even beyond. And of course, it's easier to do this in areas where there's a clear European responsibility, such as medicines regulation. It's not so clear in the area of health policy because the responsibility is at national level. And of course, this makes sense because health systems differ. There are different availability of vaccines and therapeutics. And as we've just seen, the epidemiological situation may be very different as well. But I think what we're learning is that it's very important that we share messages, that we ensure transparency, we ensure that decisions are science-based, and this will allow messages to be adapted to a local context. But specifically in terms of what we can do better, I just want to highlight that we're looking at lessons learned following our experience over the last 22 months. And one of the areas where we have identified as a strong area of focus with our national regulatory authorities is the whole area of communication and interaction with other stakeholders, including public health bodies. So this is an area that we know we have to do some more work, and it's been highlighted as part of our priority areas for the next couple of months.
Thank you very much, Emer. A lot going on to bring all the data together and make sure it's shared, and that we can really share a common message with stakeholders. Juan.
Yes, we have a question from the external audience, and there is about long-term COVID, and they are acknowledging the concerns about long-term COVID, and even there is a suspected presence of coronavirus, even if it's not detectable via PCR. And even they are talking about that some conditions might predispose to different forms of long COVID. And they're asking about what EMA and the network are doing in terms of research, and whether even if is NSEP involved in follow-up of these patients to understand the pathophysiology.
So perhaps I'll ask Marco first, just to say a few words about the long COVID, and then I'll pass to Peter Arlett on how that might be followed up with various data monitoring processes. Marco.
Oh, yes, I think, as I said also in my presentation, that the issue of long COVID or post-acute COVID, as it might be called in the future, is a very important one, and we still don't really understand what is going on. We understand there is an extreme heterogeneity of the type of symptoms that might be carried on over time, and that they might affect different parts of the body. So we really need to set up a good research agenda to look into what we can do in order to better understand what this is in actual fact, for how long it lasts, and what are the long-term consequences. This is also very important because we may also face in the future products that might be developed specifically to target the long-term consequences of the infection with this virus. And in order to evaluate such clinical studies, we need to really understand what we're looking for. and define exactly what could be the endpoint and the clinical evaluation that we need to do. So it's an important big area that needs a lot more research, and we know that bodies like WHO are looking into that, but we need to make sure that we make use of the number of cases that we are also seeing in Europe, unfortunately, and make sure that we make good research so that we have a good understanding and we find a good way of helping all these patients.
Thanks, Marco. Perhaps, Peter, just a couple of words on how we might use real-world evidence and to follow up these evolving situations.
Yes, happy to. It's interesting. The question is fundamentally about the epidemiology of the disease rather than about any specific vaccine or therapeutic. But of course, how a disease plays out is very important to informing how drugs and vaccines are developed and how they're used. We have examples, and perhaps the best example is where the European Medicines Agency has sponsored a piece of research using electronic health records, which was coordinated by the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, to look at the natural history of thrombosis, so blood clots, which are obviously very common in COVID, but have been very relevant because of the very rare thrombosis and thrombocytopenia seen with the adenovirus vaccines. And by doing that, by researching the natural history of disease, we can better understand both drugs in development, vaccines in development, but also potentially side effects. EMA is in, and the European Regulatory Network are in a strong position because we now have access to electronic health records and health information for patients in over 21 countries in the European Union. And so if research questions come up about, for example, long COVID, we're in a good position to do studies. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. We're really following this very carefully. Juan.
Yes, we can now give the floor to Jan de Belli, who is in the room.
Please.
Thank you very much.
You want to
yes.
on your camera, perhaps, if you have one.
Yes, I hope you can see and hear me.
Please go ahead. There.
Thank you very much, first of all, for very interesting presentations and this opportunity also for the public and healthcare professionals to listen into all the science that you have collected on these very key issues. My question is around the co-administration of COVID-19 vaccines with other types of vaccines, because obviously there is a very crucial need to continue also routine immunization programs, and there has been some questions raised, also practical questions, for instance, on whether, for instance, COVID-19 vaccines can be administered with, for instance, flu vaccines, since we are, of course, also in the midst of the seasonal flu vaccination campaign. My question is whether you have indeed any evidence on effectiveness and safety of indeed the co-administration of COVID-19 vaccines with other types of vaccines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. Really important, and especially as you say, with the flu season also coming on us. Marco.
No, yeah, indeed. And this is something that we have been following up, and already a study has delivered some important data. They look into co-administration of different influenza vaccines together with different COVID-19 vaccines. And the results are very reassuring because they show that you can do that without problems. And so this is very important indeed, particularly considering the need of boosting people, which essentially the primary target is the same one as vaccination for influenza, like with the over 65s and other risk groups. So these data are very important. We will make also formal assessment, but these are already out. We already seen them, and we think the message is that you can go ahead with the co-administration. With respect to other vaccine, we will look if more evidence will be generated, but maybe there is not such a stringent need of going with co-administration with other vaccines for the time being, and probably influenza is indeed the main target for a potential co-administration.
Thanks very much, Marco, and thank you, Jan, for the question. Very important. Juan.
We will now take a question from the internal room from Ines Pri, who is asking that in the risk management plan, it's highlighted that there are no studies on carcinogenicity and genotoxicity. And this is in accordance to WHO guidelines. And the question is whether this is considered, is still be needed, or whether this is too outdated and which is the current situation in terms of requirements.
So thank you, Ines, for the question. I'll pass that to Marco Cavalieri. Please, Marco.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that we don't need such studies with the vaccines, because there is no scientific reason why we think this effect will occur after vaccination, either with a messenger RNA, a viral vector, or in the future with a subunit vaccine. So very simply, there is no need to conduct this study, because scientifically they would not be motivated at all.
Thank you, Marco. Juan.
Yes, we'll give now the floor to Francois Houillet in the room.
Hello, Francois, please take the floor. Okay, Juan, perhaps we'll pick another question while Francois connects.
I will read another one and then we will give the floor afterwards to Francois. Sure. We have a question from the outside audience, which is asking, they would like to understand how feedback from academia is incorporated into regulatory decisions on COVID-19 therapeutics, but at the same time, they're asking whether patients are somehow involved in the work we do.
So perhaps, Marco, you can reflect on how we bring together data from wide range of sources. Please go ahead.
Yes, indeed. When we assembled this emergency task force to face the pandemic and to be quite flexible but very rapid in giving answer to developers, we felt that it was extremely important to have a representation of both healthcare professionals and patients into this group, and to have their voice at the table so that we can take into account what is their thinking, what is their advice and suggestion. So we really believe that after the experience that we gained, this has worked very well. And even we may think in the future to see how we can move forward and even strengthening the presence of patient representatives and healthcare workers into this emergency task force. This is extremely valuable, and for us it's been really important to hear their input.
Melanie, you could also speak a bit more broadly about how we involve the patients and consumers and with our working parties and other aspects in these decisions.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Fergus. Indeed, I mean, more broadly speaking, we work in EMA as a network, and we bring scientific experts from across Europe, not only as members of our scientific committees, but also our working parties and through representation in our scientific advisory groups. And more and more we're involving patients as patient experts to sit alongside academics, and that really enriches the conversation and makes sure that we bring the patient voice throughout the development process. I mean, I could wax lyrical on this, but to keep it short, we involve patients and academia as experts in preparation of scientific guidelines, in developing and giving scientific advice, in the review of our product information, in the review of our communication materials. And then, you know, in the assessment process, we can convene meetings of ad hoc experts as needed on specialized topics. So, I mean, there's a wealth of areas where we involve experts, both academic, healthcare professionals, and patients throughout the development life cycle. Over.
Thanks very much, Melanie. I think it's important to emphasize also that we're constantly monitoring the literature every day, and we bring the findings from many studies being done and published in academia to our reviews at TTF, CHMP, and PRAC that's relevant for the particular issues. So now I understand, Francois, you're back with us, so please take the floor.
Yes, thank you. And my first question is that many patients who do not respond to vaccines due to underlying conditions could use the monoclonal antibodies for which the EMA provided an opinion on the early use. And it's important to know in which member states we have programs for these patients. Member states have an obligation to notify their programs and compassionate use to the EMA. So my simple question is, do you have an overall idea on how many member states follow or use the opinion on early use? And a question to ECDC, do you use techniques to model the epidemics in the next weeks or month in Europe? Thank you.
So perhaps ask Melanie first if we have that information on compassionate use and are able to relay that, and then I'll move to Piotr.
Yeah, regarding compassionate use, I mean, when we issue an opinion on compassionate use, we publish it very rapidly. The uptake by the member states, I don't believe that we publish that, but I perhaps ask whether Marco would have an update, whether we get feedback into the ETF on that.
Yeah, I think this is done informally, and we always ask member states what they're doing because it's very important for us to understand the impact of our decision, but also whether there is any program that has been attempted by any of the member states before we give this type of opinion. So this is an area in which we understood the importance of keeping channel of communications open, and we will be improving how this is happening. But again, this is done more on an informal way at this point in time.
Well, thank you, Marco. Yes, perhaps an area also for the lessons learned in terms of improving communication. The question also for you, Piotr, on the epidemiology and how we're monitoring that.
Thank you. Indeed, we conduct mathematical modeling to try to predict the developments of the pandemic over the next weeks and months. Of course, the further down in time, the more difficult it is and the more uncertainty. But you can see the outputs of this modeling on the one hand on the website which is called European Forecast Hub, where we actually combine the results of our modeling with the results of other modeling groups. And you can see there's some forecasts and predictions of what will happen. On the ECDC website, when you look at the country overviews, you will see term modeling, and according to this modeling, the situation will continue to deteriorate, unfortunately. You can see the conclusions of our modeling in our rapid risk assessment that we published yesterday. We took into account the main factors that I showed in my presentation, the spread of the Delta variant and its transmissibility, the suboptimal levels of vaccine uptake, and other factors. And the conclusions were that the situation will deteriorate during December and January. Also, given that people will increase contact rates around the festive end of year season, unless the countries, especially those with low or moderate vaccination coverages, implement stricter non-pharmaceutical interventions. And those with the highest vaccine uptake maintain their current non-pharmaceutical interventions. If this doesn't happen, then the situation will deteriorate further during December and January.
Thank you, Piotr, and really emphasizing the need for all of us to make sure we've got our full vaccination coverage, and also go for our boosters as soon as the opportunity arises. I think it's really, really important to protect everybody that we're able to do this. Juan.
Thank you. We'll continue with a question from the internal room. This is from Margarita Del Val, and she's asking actually two questions to Marco Cavalieri. One is whether we can discuss about the evidence that the protection is waning over time, whereas you can elaborate further on that. And the second one is more about the statements on the pregnancy and mRNA vaccines, and whether we can comment if how this applies on adenovirus-based vaccines and pregnancy.
Marco.
Okay, on the first one, there are nowadays a number of publications in the scientific literature that show that antibodies, they decay over time, which is natural that they do, by the way. We should not be too surprised about that. But also that such decrease of antibodies over time is paralleled by a decrease of protection from infection and at least mild COVID in a number of studies conducted in different parts of the world. So the signal that has been emerging is that at least after 5 months from vaccination with the messenger RNA, but I think we can say something similar also for the adenoviral vector, we really see a decrease in the protection that was initially achieved, and particularly from infection, because it's more difficult to protect from infection than from disease. And so these data are quite important because they would support the fact that a booster dose then would be extremely beneficial in such circumstances. And the data that we do have that support the use of a booster dose approximately after 6 months from completion of the primary series of a messenger RNA vaccine are showing that the immune response that is elicited is really robust and brings back the level of the antibodies to a level that was not even reached at the completion of the primary vaccination series. So this is a very important aspect to keep in mind, because if we show that you will restore not only the same level of protection that you achieved initially, but most likely for a much longer period of time. So, so all the data that we're seeing, both from an immunological perspective, but also from real-world evidence, are supporting the fact that we see some decrease of protection, which, by the way, is not necessarily with respect to severe disease. For severe disease, we are still seeing quite robust protection in many parts of the world from all the vaccines that we're using, but at least from infection and mild disease, this is happening. And of course, in the most vulnerable, it means that some of this mild disease may then convert into severe disease, and that's why boosters are important. With respect to your second question about pregnancy, we have seen a number of large studies actually conducted and published that would show that particularly the messenger RNAs, which have been more widely used in the context of pregnancy, are safe, and also they're able really to protect the mothers and the children from getting infected. So these data are extremely relevant, and we will be looking at them quite closely in order to see whether we can make changes with respect to our recommendation for using pregnant women, because as said, the burden of disease for pregnant women is quite high, and vaccine could also save lives here. So it's important that we consider using the vaccines in pregnant women. Unfortunately, we don't have the same level of evidence for other platform technology, but we look forward to see what we can do there as well.
Thank you, Marco. Juan.
We'll read now a question from the outside, and their question is about third doses with a booster that has been developed or contains the same strain as if in 2019. And they're asking that if we can better explain how this can really work now that we know the virus has mutated several times.
This is really important to understand. Marco, you can help us with this.
Yes, a bit following up to what I was saying before, what happens, what we're seeing actually is when you give a booster dose of a messenger RNA vaccine, your antibodies, they really climb up to a level that is 3 times what you achieved after the primary vaccination. And moreover, these antibodies are very capable of cross-neutralizing the new variants, including the Delta, to the point that actually it does not look there is any need at this point in time to change the composition of the vaccine, because an homologous booster with the same strain is able to do the job. Of course, in the future, if the virus will change additionally, a new mutation will come up, we may have to consider changing the composition of the vaccine, and we are prepared to do that. We also have guidelines that clearly explain what should be done by developers in order to do so in a timely manner. But for today, with respect to the Delta and even Delta Plus that are predominant at this point in time, we believe that the boosters are able to cope with them, and very good cross-neutralization and protection will be achieved there as well.
Thank you very much, Marco. Juan, who is our next question from?
We can give the floor now to Enrique Alteri.
Okay, please, Enrique, you have the floor, and switch on your camera if you have one.
Yes. Hello.
Hello, Enrique.
It's video. Hello. Thank you very much to my former colleagues of EMA. These initiatives are very important, I believe, to bring the voice of EMA and of science to the European public. I have 2 questions. One is to Dr. Krammertz, and I would like to know if what are the initiatives that the ECDC or other European institution take in terms of cooperation and collaboration with non-EU countries, particularly to the East, because we see that we share a border with a number of countries where the virus is very widespread and where the vaccine resistance and hesitancy is also very high. So because the borders, of course, are porous, we would like to know how do we collaborate with those countries. And the second question is for Marco. And I would like to ask Marco, from the perspective of the healthcare systems, we have a number of interventions, the vaccines and the medicines. But if I am an healthcare professional or provider in a new country, how do I put that into a context? What is the value of these interventions, the vaccines versus, for example, the therapeutic interventions? I'm asking that because, as you are aware, in a number of the Novax interventions really focus on the fact that why do we need to immunize billions of people when we can target our intervention with treatment to only a few 100,000 or a couple of millions. So I would like to have from Marco a little bit more context in that respect. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Enrica. Now, two important questions. So first to yourself, Piotr, regarding perhaps the outreach across Europe and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, of course, this is a global issue, and we need to collaborate globally. And this is one of the encouraging factors, that there has been such an intensive collaboration globally since the beginning of this pandemic. This is really reassuring. In terms of what we do is we are engaging with other countries, depending on which are these countries, through different mechanisms. We, of course, work with the World Health Organization, the European office in Copenhagen, because the European region of WHO has many more countries than the EU reaching out to the east. So this is one main channel of our collaboration there. But we also collaborate closer with the countries which are in the neighborhood policy group of countries through the Eastern Partnership, and then we go through the European Commission, of course. And on a more global level, we collaborated very closely with a number of CDCs globally, of course, with the CDC in Atlanta, with the Public Health Agency in Canada, early on with the public health authorities in China at the beginning of the pandemic, especially, and then with Africa CDC. So we have regular exchanges of information, and we collaborate very closely.
So thank you, Piotr. And Marco, a question on the value of vaccines and therapeutics and their roles, please.
Yeah, thanks. An important question, Enrica. Indeed, is an opportunity to remind everybody that vaccines are essential. If we want to get out of this pandemic, there is no alternative to vaccination. Vaccination remains the crucial aspect of our response. This is not going to change. Of course, vaccines alone are not sufficient. We know the importance of the non-pharmaceutical intervention as well in order to limit the spread of the virus. Particularly now in Europe, we are facing this with this big wave of Delta with the cold season. But I think it's important to remember and to remind everybody that therapeutics can only play a complementary role. They cannot replace vaccines. Anyway, they are helpful because, as said, there are still many people who get infected with SARS-CoV-2 even when they are vaccinated. They might go to the hospital. So it's important that we have tools to treatment, to cure them, and to get them back to their normal life. So that's why we're still working hardly on therapeutics as well, because we think it's an important domain. But this is a domain that is really complementary to the vaccine, not at all something that can replace them.
Thanks very much, Marco. Really, really important message, and emphasizing again the need for vaccination. Juan.
Yeah, I will read a question from the outside, and it regards to today's recommendation to use now the vaccine community in children. age 5 to 11. And they are asking about what about the adverse side effects, which has been seen in the study, and what has been reported, there has been any death, etc. So they would like to know about that.
So perhaps this on the safety, perhaps Georgi, could you respond? Thank you.
Thanks, Fergus. I can start, and then Marco maybe can complement because he might have more intimate view on the clinical trial data. Because at this stage, in children, the use of Comirnaty, the information we have on safety comes from the clinical trial results. To the best of my knowledge, there are no safety issues that differ from what we already knew in the older patient populations. So that's the first thing to state. None of the, so I talked about myocarditis. We have not seen cases in the clinical trials in children. However, we will continue to monitor, of course, because this is a very rare side effect, so it wouldn't be expected to be seen in a smaller number of vaccinates exposed. So no issues to flag, but I would like Mark to comment as well. Thank you.
No, and perhaps also to emphasize, we're able to follow and get data from across the world on the use of these vaccines. So Marco.
No, indeed, just following up to what Georgi was saying, in the clinical trial with 3,000 children that received the Comirnaty vaccine, and we have not seen anything really significant emerging. In actual fact, even the most common adverse event after administration of the vaccine, like fever, headache, malaise, pain on the arm, they were the frequency was lower than what we see in young adults or in the adolescents. And one of the reasons might well be that here we're using a dose that is lower than what has been approved for adolescents and young adults. So the immune response is still good, but the overall reactogenicity profile seems to be slightly better, which is extremely reassuring. 3,000 children is quite a large data set for children overall, but for rare adverse event indeed would not be sufficient. And of course, we are not seeing any case of myocarditis, as Georgi said, but we will continue to monitor in case this could happen once there is a broader use.
Thanks very much, Marco. And of course, the constant monitoring and vigilance continues. Juan.
Joseph Dradbell has her hand raised. I'm not sure if it is the case anymore. Otherwise, I will read the questions she put on the chat.
Jose, do you want to take the floor?
Yep. I think everything is working now. Yes, thank you very much indeed. What I wanted to just sort of ask, and that's more of a member of the public, when the serious adverse effects were reported within particular vaccine, there were so many complaints, and people became much more convinced that you shouldn't have a vaccine because it was dangerous, etc., etc. In the meantime, millions of people have been vaccinated and received the protection of that particular vaccine. But what I want to know is what sort of counter information at that particular moment was issued by the EMA, and also was there any medical follow-up saying, well, maybe it occurred in people with a particular underlying problem. And I think if we had that sort of information, it would have, I think, helped to restore the confidence that really was lost. And as I said, it plays in the hands of the anti-vaxxers. Thank you.
So perhaps, Georgi, I'll ask you first if you could comment on the process of looking at the benefit risk and confirming that we went through, and then Melanie can comment on information and how we make that available. Georgi.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As with any medicines, I was saying in my presentation, when millions of people are exposed, we will come across issues that are rare, but could be serious side effects. Now that this shows that our pharmacovigilance system works and it functions well. I think when we detect those issues, I think it's key that in a very swift manner we characterize them as much as we can based on the available information, and then we communicate that to the public. Communicating those serious events to the public leads to awareness of symptoms, can lead to much better prognosis, so early detection, early treatment of this condition. We've seen that with serious, a very, very rare TTS, thrombosity with thrombocytopenia over time, based on the quick evaluation and then awareness of patients, healthcare professionals. We've seen reduction in more serious outcomes. Now, this is kind of maybe goes without saying. Communication is very important because those events, although very rare, could very well be taken out of context and can fuel anti-vaccine sentiments. So maybe Melanie can elaborate a little bit further on communication. We've had a really, really extensive communications, including these press briefings which we have regularly, where we could address any concerns, but Melanie would be a better place to elaborate. Thank you.
Melanie.
Yeah, thanks, Georgi, and thanks, Jose, for the question. Indeed, as Georgi highlights, when it comes to safety, we aim to communicate very rapidly. We will provide information very swiftly on what we know and also what we don't know, and also what work is ongoing at the level of the Pharmaceutical Risk Assessment Committee to evaluate the report or the safety signal if it is classified as such. We will issue a public health communication, and within that, we work very carefully to make sure that we target particular message to patients, but also to healthcare professionals. We share it across the network. We share it with our international regulators. We try and spread the messages as rapidly as we can and update regularly. And then as and when more information becomes available, if there are any risk factors identifiable, the product information will be updated. We'll do another round of communication, and where applicable, we'll also do direct communication to healthcare professionals. So the countermeasures are there. I think what we have often seen with vaccines is this rapid circulation across social media. So we are working very carefully with our partners across Europe and across the globe to try and get the message out as quickly as possible. Over.
Thank you, Melanie. And perhaps, Peter, I could ask you to make a few comments both on the intensive research that we do in follow-up to the identification of rare adverse experience reactions, but also on looking at the disease burden and really putting this into context as well. Thank you.
Yes, just briefly. So firstly, we need to detect potential side effects very quickly. We then need to evaluate them very quickly. And then we need to look at them in the context of the benefits of either treatment, if we're talking about a therapeutic, or prevention of disease, if we're talking about a vaccine. And I think we've got good evidence that in the European Union, we've been able to do that. And the thrombosis with thrombocytopenia cases is a case in point. Specifically, we've used background rates of thrombosis to help contextualize the reports coming to the Eurovigilance database. We've also used data from ECDC, as well as vaccination data from other sources, looking at disease burden, looking at hospitalizations, and looking at deaths to help us contextualize the very rare cases of thrombosis with thrombocytopenia seen. And some members of the webinar will remember the communications that were put out in April, where we tried to put those risks in the context of benefits. And I think the feedback we got from stakeholders was very positive. I think the key thing to say is that the reason we were able to do that is that we had been very proactive in putting in place data collection mechanisms so that we did have the background rates of thrombosis. We did understand vaccination rates. We did understand the number of patients being admitted to hospital and dying from COVID. And putting all of this together allowed us to contextualize and to put out very positive messages that overall the benefits and risks of vaccination are overwhelmingly favorable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and really important to see in the big picture. These are extremely rare events, and the vaccines are, as also data from Piotr has demonstrated, a really high benefit to health. Juan, I think we've time for one or two more questions.
Yes, we have a question regarding, well, which is the current narrative we are seeing in the pandemic about this infodemic of unvaccinated people versus vaccinated people, and how this can be subject to even political debate, and whether we can elaborate more about that, and which is our official position at EMA, and whether this polarization is right or wrong, or what is our recommendations in terms of maybe coming back about vaccination, etc.
So I think, thank you very much, Juan. I think as all the speakers have emphasized, it's really important to become vaccinated, for people who are already vaccinated to complete their courses, or as the boosters become available to obtain those. The data shows that where there are high levels of population who are unvaccinated, the rates of serious death, death and serious disease are much higher. It clearly offers very significant protection to the population, and we really want to be able to make contact with everybody and assure you that the vaccines are very safe, and that they are able to combat this pandemic and protect you, your families, your fellow citizens against this disease, and also protect our health systems, because if they are overcrowded with COVID patients, then other diseases have to wait as well. So very important that we all work together to fight this pandemic, and the best way is to ensure that we are all vaccinated. Thanks, Juan. Maybe another question, do we?
Yeah, we have, I mean, it's more a question, it's a practical question. There are people who are congratulating for the event, but they're asking whether we would be willing to have a Facebook channel, or what other means to combat misinformation we can have.
So no, I think it's really important that we can carry on the dialogue through different means. So perhaps Melanie, you can tell us how we can continue this dialogue with the public, which is so important.
Yes, thank you, Fergus, and thank you for the question. And as we said, we are very keen to engage further with the public, to hear your views, your concerns, your comments, and you can contact the EMA directly through our Ask EMA website. You can reach out to us also through meetings such as these. We have regular meetings with stakeholder groups which are advertised on our website. We reach out through social media on our Twitter channel and on our LinkedIn channel. And if there are other events or opportunities where you feel EMA should field a speaker, or you'd like to have some engagement with us, we would very much welcome those comments. So yes, any opportunities, we'd be very happy to engage with the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I think, Juan, we've maybe room for one or two short ones, or somebody, I don't know if anybody's, I don't see any hands up.
Yeah, I think we have another question which is asking whether all the studies we are looking as part of the evaluations, whether they come from the outside, or whether we are doing also our own studies.
Perhaps Marco, you can answer that.
Yeah, I think we are looking at any source of information with respect to studies and either randomized clinical trials, and also the importance of real world evidence. And this is becoming quite a big and important area for vaccines. We knew that already. We have been used them in the past. And of course, we are also quite active here. But maybe I will hand over to Peter that he can say more about what our activities from an EMA point of view.
Indeed, thanks, Marco. Peter, please go ahead, because there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so indeed there is a lot going on. So I think the first thing to say is that the European Medicines Agency looks at all available data and information, evidence, if you like, that could inform on the development, authorization, and supervision of therapeutics and vaccines. So, you know, eyes wide open, but also proactively acting to make sure that if there are knowledge gaps or we predict knowledge gaps, we can fill them. So all types of data and all types of methodologies, clinical trials, real world evidence, non-clinical, all taken into account. And who is the source of this information? It ties in with one of the questions earlier. Industry has a critical role in the development and oversight of their products. Academia has been hugely important during the pandemic, as have public health authorities around the world. Data coming from the US, from China, from Israel, and from the European Union. At EMA, we realized that we needed to put in place infrastructure and consortia and networks to support our evaluation of the vaccines and the therapeutics. And we realized this very early, right back in the calling of the pandemic in early 2020. And we invested in setting up networks in particular, which now are delivering results. So these are networks on pregnancy, networks on vaccine surveillance, networks on therapeutic surveillance, both active collection of data, so observational in that it's not a randomized controlled trial, but where you collect data in a prospective way from patients, but also retrospective use of data, so looking at electronic health records to see about the epidemiology of disease, about how vaccines and therapeutics are used, and potentially then evaluating safety issues and looking at effectiveness. So I think the key point to say is we look at all available evidence to make the best informed decisions, and we need to be proactive. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And it's really important to understand that we never take our eye off the ball. This is a constant work of improving our knowledge on the vaccines and also on the disease and the effect of vaccines and medicines on that. So I'd really like to thank everyone. It's been very dynamic and really enriching to hear your concerns and hopefully be able to address the questions you've asked. We hope you're all reassured and leave the meeting with an enriched understanding of how the COVID medicines are assessed and approved by the EMA, as well as how they are being rolled out, continuously monitored, and the information from ECDC has been really important, and how we follow up on new information and continue, as Peter says, the research efforts and continue to update information to the public on these vaccines and therapeutics. We are working very closely with our medicines agency partners and public health bodies in the member states across the EU network to work to ensure that our evaluations are conducted as urgently as we can, but ensuring the scientific rigor of that, so that we are able to inform the public and give assurance about the standards and the data on which we've evaluated these medicines, vaccines, and therapeutics. So really we can bring this for you to use. We hope you are reassured on the approval of all the medicines and that this is based on a rigorous process which enables us to provide good evidence of efficacy and of safety and to continue to monitor those once they're rolled out to citizens. All 4 approved vaccines in the EU have shown a very good level of protection against serious COVID disease and death and continue to demonstrate that. This pandemic with COVID-19 is really the worst health crisis in a century, and vaccines have given us the hope that we can overcome it. We're entering the winter with rising infection rates, but we are in a much better place than we were 12 months ago. Although the real world evidence has shown that the current vaccines have been effective in reducing hospitalizations and deaths, the virus is still circulating. We know that immunity, whether it's given by vaccines or by previous natural infection, wanes over time. So we need to keep monitoring, keep vigilant, and look at the benefits of booster doses, as well as the need for other non-medical interventions. We need to maintain our use of face masks, hand washing, social distancing to ensure we can all be best protected. Emerging therapeutics for COVID-19 patients show potential as an additional tool to fight the pandemic. However, as Marco has emphasized, we should not take our eyes off the vaccine efforts. It is important to encourage people to get vaccinated, to complete their initial course, as well as to get booster doses if recommended to do so. By using all the weapons at our disposal and all working together as co-citizens, we can make a difference and we can get through this pandemic and come out of the other side. And the better we do that, the sooner we will reach there. On the safety front, Georgi has very well explained, hundreds of millions of people have now been vaccinated worldwide with the 4 approved vaccines. And indeed, I should add, the clinical trials on the basis of which we approved them were among the largest we've seen for any medicine. And therefore, we know that people have no side effects or few and mild ones in the large majority following vaccination. However, the EU has a sophisticated pharmacovigilance system. It's robust and rigorous and rapidly follows up on reports and signals. And it's bringing unprecedented levels of scrutiny to these medicines. And where very rare but serious side effects have been picked up, we have the means to rapidly identify them and take action, advise healthcare professionals and the public, and minimize any risk to the public. But it's really important that we have the contribution from patients, healthcare professionals, and the general public in reporting those side effects so that we can keep our information current and our database large. And Georgi has shown you the extent of information we have available, and including as much relevant information in our reports as possible. Activities like today's meeting, and we really welcome and value the input of all people and professionals across the public. Activities like this help to convey messages, help us to bring attention to the reliable scientific sources such as EMA and ECD's websites, and we really encourage people always go to those sources. Because you see something on social media or elsewhere, don't trust it. Please use the recommended official sources, and we are being very transparent in that and providing very good information, and we've given you the links, so please circulate those. We will continue collaborating. The fight against COVID-19 is a global effort. It involves medicines developers, regulators, policymakers, healthcare professionals and institutions and citizens. We all need to work together. We need to combat the pandemic, share information, share good information, and continue to base our decisions on validated scientific evidence. We can beat this pandemic if we all work together, get vaccinated, and keep on with our rigorous scientific work as regulators and scientists. Now, on a more practical note, although we may not have been able to take all the comments and questions at this time, and there were a lot coming in on the Slidos and other media channels, all of your input will be shared with the relevant people working on COVID-19 so that it can be considered during our ongoing work. A recording of this meeting will be published on our website in a few days for all the benefit of those who were not able to watch today, or you can share it with colleagues and friends who may also like to see that. And in addition, we aim to continue holding public meetings to ensure we keep the public updated of our work and role in this pandemic. And rest assured, as we've explained, we have representatives of the patient community and healthcare professionals within our different scientific groups, and we constantly are updating these groups and enabling them to disseminate the latest news. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our speakers, our panelists, but really to you, the general public, for all the questions and attention. And we hope we've been able to give you good information, respond to as many of your questions as possible, and we'll continue to work hard to do that. Thank you very much.